All right, for those that are online, do you want to just talk about what we're going to be doing today? I'll get the maps up.
Yeah. So today's session will basically focus on the northern protected areas on the island. So for the most part, that actually comprises pretty much the entirety of the northern province, save for maybe the southern portion of the Mannar district. But this area of the island is basically, well, at least in the mainland north, that area basically which stretches from coast to coast, west to east, is known as the Vanni Forest Region historically. So there are a lot of Department of Forest Conservation protected areas in this huge cluster, and most of them date back to British times. So I believe the oldest one in that grouping dates back to 1895, I believe. And on average, most of those protected areas date around 1920, 1922. So these are protected areas that have been in existence for a long, long time. But interestingly, I guess, due to the war and just the general lack of conservation measures that have been implemented in the north, it's not an area that you would traditionally think of for wildlife conservation and protected areas. So that's something we're trying to break here today, that mold, basically.
Yeah. And like when you look at the map, you can see there is a lot of coverage, especially below the Jaffna Peninsula. Yeah. But in that coverage, only 3 national parks do exist. One is the Madhu Road, then Chundikulum, and Delphi Island National Parks. And they're actually, other than Madhu, the other 2 are extremely small.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just show them on the map as well where.
Yeah. Show them the rough areas. You see, the problem with this
Madhu is just in this region.
Yeah.
While Chundikulum is here, just where the peninsula does start, near where Elephant Pass and all that goes in. It's on this coastline. And then Delphi Island, which is the bottom half, the southern section of the island.
Yeah. So keep in mind the reason why these protected areas don't show up on this map is actually pre-2015.
Yep.
And a lot of these national parks were only actually gazetted in 2015 and onwards.
Yep. And this region predominantly is known for its avian fauna, which are the migratory birds that do come into Sri Lanka. And this is the first point of contact with them. So it creates that habitat and protection for all these migrants. And it is a hotspot amongst birders.
So, I mean, there's a lot more to the north, make no mistake. Many people assume that the north is just somewhere, it's almost considered an alien land, I guess, due to the historical reasons. But the north is very much a key part of the conservation initiative that we are trying to push in the 21st century. Because there's so much forest cover in the north still, despite everything that has happened. It does make one wonder as to how much ecological diversity still remains in the north. Now, I can personally say from experience, having traversed the A9, the A14, all these roads that head through the northern province, I have seen tuskers at night on regular occasion, and very big tuskers that nobody knows about, or very few people have actually identified. And that's just a start. So there definitely needs to be a lot more in terms of conservation initiatives pushed in the north. Because it's not worth losing that amount of forest cover. When you say coast to coast, I literally mean from coast to coast, west to east. So I think that's part of the reason why we're doing that.
Like you said, it is definitely unexplored. Mainly due to the fact that it's only probably been really opened up in the last 10 years because of inability to travel up north earlier on. So in the last 10 years, but in those last 10 years, you do see a lot of deforestation and all that activity that is happening now with it opening up as well. Yeah, so these are the things that we need to try and avoid and maybe better plan while there is so much coverage up there. So the way we do things and now explore the north, and that is as conservationists as well as people developing the land, we need to come up with proper planning methods and ways it can be done.
Yeah. So if we start with Chundikulum National Park, I guess Chundikulum is one that many people will historically refer to as a bird sanctuary, which in a way is partially accurate because it is a location that was chosen for its avian fauna, but it was actually gazetted originally as a wildlife sanctuary in 1938. And it was only in 2015, as per Extraordinary Gazette number 1920-3, that it was finally upgraded to national park status and enlarged in size. And currently it sits as our 11th largest national park, I believe, at 190 square kilometers. Yep. And it's pretty diverse. You know, we're talking remnant populations of big saltwater crocodiles, 16-footers on average, a small remnant population of Sri Lankan sloth bears, and of course the greater flamingo. It's one of the key sites for the greater flamingo migrations from the mainland to Sri Lanka.
Yep. Definitely. And you did mention it was initially known as a wildlife sanctuary. And that
Yeah,
is probably where the term bird sanctuary comes in, because lots of people do refer to wildlife sanctuaries as bird sanctuaries
yeah,
because
exactly.
probably they're not as high up on the tiers of protected areas. So that is where that comes in, I think. That's where that mistake is made.
And it also provides quite a conservation initiative in the sense, now many of you will probably be aware, for those who have tuned in, that villus in Wilpattu are basically these natural sand rim depressions or natural lakes that you get in the park, which are basically the ecological heart of the park, as it were, when it comes down to it. Similarly, in Chundikulum National Park, you actually get a feature which is known as a kulam, or a natural pond. And if you look at Chundikulum, especially along the coastline, where most of the remaining pristine northern dry zone dry evergreen forest is, you can actually see these kulams. They act just like the villus in that they draw in large amounts of avian fauna. All the terrestrial big five that we get, that is confirmed in Chundikulum also lives in that area. And in general, it just turns it into quite an ecological hotspot. So there's a significant importance, I would say, for Chundikulum.
Yep. And while you're on that point, we can talk about the other fact that there are a lot of inland lagoons in this area. With the way
Exactly.
especially on the coastal areas where the inland lagoons do form, there are a lot, and especially on the peninsula. And that is where another big aspect of the avian fauna coming in use these inland lagoons for
Yeah.
feeding and all that other activity. And that is what creates this biodiversity that we have up there.
Yeah.
Especially for, like you
And
said earlier, the flamingos. They from initially were found in Bundala as well, but then
yeah.
water pH and all changed with the development that has happened, and now one of the only places that you do get big flocks of flamingo are still up here in the north.
Yeah, and if we can link on, I guess, do you remember I told you about Irinamadu? If we can show that on the map for these
Yep.
guys. Much like Chundikulum, you see, with greater flamingos, they need a certain balance when it comes to brackish water and freshwater ecosystems. And while they get that brackish water environment close to the coastal areas of Chundikulum National Park, there is another Department of Forest Conservation protected area called the Irinamadu National Reserve Forest. And because of its enormous reservoir, this National Reserve Forest is another one of the key locations where greater flamingos come to Sri Lanka when they migrate. And one of the reasons for that is, based on the initial research that has been done, they have found that the Irinamadu Reservoir, which consists of now 30% of that National Reserve Forest, is occupied by large numbers of flamingos when they come down to Sri Lanka. So again, from an avian standpoint, these sites are critical, especially when we're looking at great flamingos and other avian fauna.
Definitely. And another big talked about one is probably Yodawaba or Giant's Tank. And
Yes.
that, again, is a well-known water source and where you find lots of these migratory birds and ducks.
And what's interesting about Giant's Tank is it's, again, much like many of the wildlife sanctuaries in the north, it's been in existence since 1954, if I remember correctly. So the thing about Giant's Tank is not only does it attract huge flocks of normally rare birds to Sri Lanka. For example, about 3 years ago, it attracted 50 odd glossy ibis to Sri Lanka, which was a fantastic sight to see for those who got to see it. It also borders Mother Road National Park directly, so that there is that connectivity and that contiguousness. So basically, any example of wildlife that lives in Mother Road National Park, or what was to become Mother Road National Park in 2015, can go back and forth between Giant's Tank and Mother Road. So there is a significant level of importance, especially, which I'm sure you can agree with when it
Yeah,
comes to
and
Giant's Tank.
like we did mention earlier on, you see all this coverage on the map, and only 3 of them are national parks. So everything else falls into the other protected areas. I
Yeah,
think 3 are nature reserves, and then 4 being sanctuaries, and then further on. But all the others are national reserve forests, which fall
yeah,
under the Department of Wildlife Conservation. So
yeah.
that just shows that there's so much coverage and working together with both departments, because the Department of Forest Conservation does have most control in this area and are in
Yeah.
charge of most of the protected areas.
And also, we can't let sight of the fact that these Department of Forest Conservation protected areas could be filled with terrestrial big five. And I know terrestrial big five is just one element of it. There are other elements such as small flora and fauna as well. But terrestrial big five is one of the factors that will ensure that these protected areas are either utilized in a sustainable manner, maybe even for ecotourism, or they may be destroyed depending on what the development agenda for the island is. So there definitely needs to be more of an awareness, built around these protected areas.
Definitely. And that is the key thing. We were talking about how this area is unexplored. And now with everything getting better up in the north, there is a lot of development that is coming in. But just the proper land use and coming up with proper plans, because there's so much protected area and fauna and flora and fauna in this zone. And you can see it on the map, on the coverage. So just coming up with ways. We got predominantly there are the two roads in this area. The A9 going straight up to Jaffna and then the A14 going to Mannar. So those are the two big roads, but then you do get some of the other A30 roads that do cut across and join. But just the way these roads are managed and the way settlements come in around this, when you do look at these maps on a satellite image, or when you do look at these protected areas on a satellite image, you do see all the degradation that is already happening. So it's a way of controlling this and managing it. What would you say on that point?
I mean, absolutely. And I think it's critical to understand that these northern terrestrial ecosystems are vital to the future of this cluster of protected areas. If I direct everybody's attention to the Kokkilai Wildlife Sanctuary, which again is often referred to as a quote-unquote bird sanctuary, this particular set of ecosystems, Kokkilai and the adjoining Department of Forest Conservation protected areas, I have heard stories and potential outcomes where it comes to leopards having been sighted almost drinking from the freshwater environs on the edge of Kokkilai. So there needs to be a real push towards showing people that these ecosystems are of critical importance. You can't just let them be degraded and then eventually destroyed. Without them, there's a good chance that a lot of the wildlife that we see in the country will be lost. Now, even from an elephant standpoint, from the wild elephant population of the island, it wouldn't be a fair stretch to say that there could be as many as 800 plus elephants living in that cluster. There's so many protected areas. So it stands to reason that the ecological diversity inside them will be just as much. And that's just yet a further reason to contribute towards, protecting all of
that. That's a good point, because earlier we were talking about the north central province of Sri Lanka and how there's a lot of elephant activity. And we were talking about how these elephants need to move around. And they do move up into these northern parts. And there are lots of elephants still in this area. And that is another big importance. But even away from the big five, if you don't even look at the big five, there's still so much other fauna and flora that is as important to our island. Because in the end, all of these are linked and they create that web as such for all these. Because even at the lowest level, it feeds up in towards those bigger fauna as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a question. Is there any groundwork happening out there? So I think the best way I can answer that, if I may go first, is that from what I have seen, there has been limited research done on a number of Department of Forest Conservation protected areas in that cluster, but the research is quite preliminary and it hasn't gone past maybe 2 to 3 page documents, but the research still has been done. So if we can build upon that research, then we can really take the ecological aspects of the northern province and show the world that Sri Lanka's northern province has a lot more to offer in terms of ecology in general.
Yeah, and from what I have seen and heard, lots of the work is more to do with avian fauna and all the activity of migratory birds coming in and all of that. But there is also work happening around these protected areas and research done, but it's all very new because like we were saying earlier in the chat, that it is only in the last 10 years that people have started going out there and exploring this area. So it is new, but there's a lot of scope in this area. So it is something we need to focus on, probably more than any of the other areas that have already been a lot of work done into them.
No, absolutely. I mean, compared to the North Central Province, for example, all the wild elephant related work that has been done, there is virtually nothing that has been done in the Northern Province itself. And even from I guess if we look to the Sri Lankan sloth bear, there's actually been talk of actually getting a proper, fully comprehensive project done, especially in Chundikulum National Park and the Terrestrial Odusandu National Reserve Forest south of it, which is a big 384 square kilometer protected area, just to understand what the remaining densities in the north for sloth bears are. So hopefully we will see that research being conducted in due time, obviously.
Yeah, lots of the stuff happening here is new. So there's a lot more work to be done, but there is work being done. It's just how the development coming into these areas with the opening up of different inability to get there earlier, there's a lot of development going in because none of this part of the country has been developed so far as such. So that is one thing we need to find a way of controlling before it does destroy everything we have.
Yeah, and
I think that is the balance that we need to find, just with the new developments that will be coming into the northern province.
And make no mistake, some of these protected areas are big. Now, Madhu Road National Park, for example, is actually 631 square kilometers. It's our third largest national park. Even Madhuroya, which comes in fourth place, is only 588 square kilometers. So there is real potential here, even from an ecotourism standpoint. Say we were to set up a proper system in conjunction with the DWC, much like we have existing for Yala and Wilpattu, we could really get, after a few years of habituation and good safari-related activity, that's done in a sustainable manner, Mother Road National Park could become the next big destination in Sri Lanka for terrestrial Big Five, for botanists, for ornithologists, for herpetofauna experts, everybody, just due to the sheer size of this national park. 631 square kilometers. I reiterate, that's not small. So the scope is there. We just need to figure out how best to utilize it, which is something
I think that is probably the important factor, the best practices, putting them into place. So that's where the research needs to be done. And like we said, it's very new what's happening here. So we spoke about Chundikulum. Do you want to talk about Delft Island now then?
Yeah, so Delft Island is quite an interesting one because you see the reason why Delft Island was actually gazetted as a national park, or a third of the island was, is due to the fact that the wild ponies that currently live in Delft Island, which initially started out as actually being brought by the Dutch approximately 250 years ago, they've actually reverted back from a domestic stage into a feral stage and now back into a wild stage. So what we have is actually an example of one of the only populations of quote unquote wild ponies in Southern Asia, I would say. And that is one of the reasons why under the Integrated United Strategic Environmental Assessment for 2015, it was decided that they would focus on Delft Island, maybe give it an ecotourism angle as well, but also to conserve these wild ponies. Now, on the ground, I wouldn't say that everything is being done yet in relation to what is needed, but they've certainly made a good start. So I think if we can build on that work, then again, Delft Island has some real potential to be, quite a destination.
And that's exactly another point. Delft Island, when you do look at it again on satellite imagery, you see how the northern sector, there is a lot of settlement and activity happening. But it's that bottom southern sector that is the protected area. So you do see that, and it's a way of controlling, stopping that filtration and all these settlements coming in, the encroachment, trying to control that. And especially on a small island like that, because if the encroachment does get too hard to control, it will destroy that ecosystem.
Yeah, and the ecological component is always important. Now, even for the lagoons that stretch much of the northern province, they've actually turned a lot of those, as I showed you earlier with those gazettes, they've turned a lot of those lagoons into protected areas. They have the protected area around the lagoon, and it also contains the lagoon itself. So, for example, they gazetted in 2015 3 nature reserves, namely Nayaru, Nandikadal, and what was the other one? I remember it was...
the nature reserves, right?
Yeah, the nature reserve. There was Nayaru, there was Nandikadal, and there was a third one. And basically, what those nature reserves basically entail is that they protect the ecological component when it comes to the riverine and semi-coastal ecosystems that are found on the edges of the northern province, because those are just as important as any of the terrestrial ecosystems as well. It doesn't necessarily mean that these are marine protected areas. They're not. Marine protected areas occupy a completely different niche. But nonetheless, that ecological component has to be protected at all costs, because it is what attracts so much avian fauna to this island. Yeah. So I guess it all ties nicely into that element of connectivity that we're going for in that sense.
And that is again where the Department of Wildlife Conservation and the DFC have to work together, because this is predominantly controlled by the DFC, and the DWC does have the big block of Madhuroya and Chundikulum and the other national park, which is Delft Island, and a few other nature reserves. But it's important to note that those 47 national reserve forests under the DFC needs to create that connectivity, because it is between Madhuroya and Chundikulum.
Yeah, and without that connectivity, we're looking at fragmentation, isolationism, even genetic divergence, and that's not good for any wildlife population. So that connectivity is absolutely critical and vital to future conservation efforts.
I could have guessed this question was going to pop up at some point. There's a question about what's happening with... Well, that so far, that is separate to this, just on that point, just to answer that question, the DWC has got there and they have tranquilized it, and so far it is in a stable condition. There hasn't been any further information that we've got. We went online soon after that. So hopefully everything goes well and it is released at some point. So fingers crossed. And moving on to, there's another estimates on the wild pony populations. Have you heard of anything on that?
So from what I understand at the moment, the wild pony population on Delft Island National Park numbers approximately 200 individuals. Now, again, this is based on preliminary estimates that were done when wildlife photographers and certain ecologists went to the island and just did some initial assessment, just to figure out, what would be the best way to conduct a basic biodiversity survey on the island. So it means that there's still viable populations, but there's also the risk of genetic divergence, especially in the sense, if there's too much inbreeding, there will be a crash in the genetic stream. So we can't say 100%, but we do still have a rough idea. And that will have to be built on in subsequent research details as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So that is again where lots of the research being very early on and how things happen.
Yeah.
Have you seen any Yeah, that's another. Actually, we were going to try and do a marine protected area session after we finish here. And that is when we would talk about that. But yes, there is a population of manatee in this area. And that is where lots of the marine protected areas do come into being important. So we will probably talk about that later on. But yes, they are up there.
Yeah, there is a population.
They are very threatened, especially on our coastline.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the last population of dugongs left on the island is pretty much found in the Mannar Basin in the northwestern coastline. I don't think there are many other places left, maybe the northernmost coast of the island itself. But we will discuss that further in the marine protected area segment. But moving back to the terrestrial protected areas in the north, there is also a couple of ecosystems that I must say. Now, for example, the Pampadi National Reserve Forest. That's an interesting one because it comprises predominantly of arid zone stunted thorn forest. And that's a very unique ecosystem that you mostly get in areas such as Yala National Park Block 2. Yet there is an entire DFC National Reserve Forest that contains these ecosystems. And usually people tend to assume that these arid zone type ecosystems are quite barren and quite devoid of life. But that's actually quite to the contrary. There's actually a lot more ecological diversity. I'm talking especially in terms of reptiles. They have discovered over the past few years a myriad of reptiles, snakes, amphibians, in general, all in the northern province due to the limited research that they have finally been able to do thanks to the end of the war. So again, there is significant importance in keeping the north viable, especially from a research standpoint.
No, 100%. And again, it goes back to the fact that it's all very new research. But there is a lot of things coming up that happen in this north. And like you said, it's like Yala Block 2, but then again, also towards Putlam and Chilau.
Yeah. It's, I think if we were to leave it for people to decide what they think of the north, the myriad and diversity of ecosystems is something that should not be missed whatsoever. You can go in these protected areas, assuming you have the necessary vehicles and you get the relevant permissions from the DWC and the DFC, and you can find yourself in an environment that you would have never seen before. Some of the ecosystems in these other protected areas don't even mirror anything that we get even in the national parks. So the scope for exploration is, it's staggering. And it's something that I really think we should make good use of in coming years, especially over the next decade. That will be the critical juncture when we decide how we are going to move the northern province forward in terms of wildlife conservation and protected areas. Definitely. So it all ties in.
Yeah, no, 100%. And it is mainly that connection between the east and the north that needs to be protected. While lots of people talk about the coastline because of the fact that lots of the avian fauna coming in is focused more on the coastlines and not in the central area of the northern province. But that is very important because for the larger fauna and the flora that you find in these areas are so important. And if we destroy this, because the A9 does run dead through the middle and creates that separation in the northern province. So it's just finding out how to balance the development that we are going to face into the future, because no matter what, we do know it's coming, and we need to find a way of that community involvement that we've been talking about.
And let's face it, we don't want to lose certain elements of the terrestrial big five that we do have in the north. Now, for example, say we were to find a viable population of leopards in the middle of that cluster of protected areas in the north. That is not something we can afford to lose by any means, because it could potentially add, 200, 250 odd leopards to the overall population and give our Sri Lankan leopard population a significant boost. Then the 16 to 18-foot saltwater crocodiles that you get in Chundikulum National Park and these other protected areas along the coastline, those are real monsters, reptiles from a bygone era. I would never want to see those lost. So there has to be a scientific approach taken, but at the same time, there is also that component of involving people. As we said, community involvement will have to play a large part in it eventually. So we have another question: is anything being done on the landmines? So from what I understand, demining operations in the northern province are at 60 to 70% so far. So I would say that in the deepest and most remote corners of the northern province, they would still be mines in certain areas. But for the most part, most of these protected areas are relatively safe. I, for one, can say that I have driven around Chundikulum National Park in a 4x4, and it's pretty safe. Most of the demining has been done, but I would also still exercise caution, because we're not at 100% when it comes to the demining yet.
No, it's mainly that they focused more on the outer regions and not within protected areas. So lots of the remote areas, like you did say, are not yet ventured as such, because they focus more on the human aspect, because when the army and forces did do the demining work there.
But keep in mind that humanitarian work was vital. It was a component of the war that we couldn't avoid. It was unavoidable. But I think now that we've moved a decade beyond the war, I think it's time for us to start focusing on the ecological component of the northern province, just so we utilize these protected areas in the appropriate manner. Because there's scopes for analog forestry, agroforestry, ecotourism. The list is endless. And I think that in itself will significantly help with GDP, as well as generally improving people's livelihoods. Because let's face it, in the north, people do struggle a lot more than the rest of the country. So there is scope for that, and I just hope that in the next few years we utilize that.
It's about finding that balance again, and then figuring out how we can properly manage it, because the land use, as long as how we involve the communities and everyone living there, just finding the right way of doing it without just going out there and coming up with a plan, doing the proper EIA assessment and the proper assessments and everything that is required before we make bigger plans. And it is the importance of connecting the DWC and the DFC.
Yeah, and ultimately, if we were to leave it on one point, the regulation has to be followed. We have a very strong Flora and Fauna Protection Ordinance, or FFPO. We have a relatively strong Forest Conservation Ordinance. So if we use those to build a structure that can be manipulated to ensure that everybody benefits from these protected areas, then we're moving along the right lines. But if we misuse it and we degrade it, then we will put ourselves down a path that we can't come back from. So it's up to us now to make that critical decision, as it were.
Yeah, 100%. And that is why lots of this research needs to be done, and lots of it is predominant. Very early, very preliminary research that is done. Yeah. And it is needed. So moving in to that northern, I think that is where people who are coming up in conservation and wanting to join the field and do things, this northern province is a very important place that they can move into, because it is unexplored, as we said at the start of this conversation.
And also, I think there is quite a bit of area of focus for even our wildlife photographers. That community as well can really spread the word. If we get a lot of these wildlife photographers into these other protected areas, and even the northern national parks, which are, have next to no visitation based on official statistics and unofficially those who go and visit, there is real precedence for us to build a database of all the wildlife that we see in the north, and that will significantly contribute to further research efforts.
Yeah. So I think that ties into my point that I was saying earlier. Lots of the people do focus more on the coast with the migratory birds coming in, but even that, people going in and exploring these areas more in the central area of the northern province, and just figuring out what is there in those unexplored protected areas, because it's not just the avian fauna coming in like we were talking about. They are maybe the big aspect of the northern province, but there's so much more within the center of the northern province. So maybe go in and visit. And again, that's what we've been saying, that when this curfew does finish, we go out there and explore unexplored protected areas and then share it
Absolutely.
with others and create that love.
And you share it, we report it back, we build our own little databases, and then we finally use it to build positive action. It's something that can be done. It's not too hard, and I think we should work towards it. It will work. I mean, I have significant hope that it will.
Yeah, hope is one of the main things that will drive us, and we have to go on it. Anyway, now we've come to the end of about half an hour. So next session, which will be the final session, which is session 7, we will be talking about Vilpattu as a forest complex and the importance of the different protected areas going down towards Chilau.
Yeah, and also the sacred city protected areas that surround Anuradhapura, because there's still protected areas, some of which actually date back to the time of the kings, not continuously, but they still do. And then the Chilau, Kurunagala, Putlam group of protected areas, which is quite small protected areas and fairly fragmented. Yeah. But we will weave those into the work that we do with the Vilpattu Forest Complex. But the big one for next time to look forward to is the protected areas in the Vilpattu Forest Complex. So, yeah. And then that will be session 7. And then we will have that ultimate session, session 8 on marine protected areas. And that will conclude the protected areas on the island once we've done the entire island itself.
Yeah. All right. So then I will talk to you on Friday again. Hopefully, yes, most of you will join us on Friday.
Yeah. So thank you to everybody who tuned in once again, and we will hopefully see you all on Friday. Till then.